The satellite feeds went dark over Caracas at exactly 3 o'clock hours, Eastern Standard Time, January 3, 2026. For 17 minutes, the world was blind. When the optics realigned, the narrative had already been written by the victors. The flashing chirons on CNN and the BBC called it a liberation, a humanitarian intervention to stabilize a crumbling region. They showed you trucks. They showed you soldiers shaking hands with locals. They showed you everything except the only thing that matters. While the world watched the humanitarian theater, a squadron of unmarked heavy-lift transport aircraft was already securing the perimeter of the Orinoco Belt. This was not a liberation. This was a liquidation event. We have entered stage 4 of the empire cycle, desperate resource acquisition. It is the phase where a hegemonic power, drowning in the mathematical certainty of its own debt, stops pretending to play by the rules of free trade and begins physically seizing the collateral needed to back its dying currency. History is a flat circle, terrifyingly repetitive to those who refuse to read it. In 265 AD, a debased Roman Empire, unable to pay its legions with diluted silver denarii, marched on its own provinces to confiscate grain and gold. Today, the asset is not grain. It is 303 billion barrels of heavy crude, sitting beneath the Venezuelan soil like a dormant savings account worth $17.3 trillion. The United States did not invade a country this week. It foreclosed on a continent. Most of you are watching the news and seeing geopolitics. You are seeing a diplomatic crisis. You're looking at the smoke. I am here to show you the fire. The United States government just paid over $1 trillion in interest on its debt for the first time in history. The ledger is bleeding. The solvency of the dollar is no longer a question of if, but when. And when the banker cannot pay in paper, he pays in blood and oil. The raid on Venezuela is not the start of a war. It is the end of the fiat experiment. The curtain has fallen on the era of paper wealth. History is written by the victors, but wealth is preserved by the prepared. The transfer has begun, and the window to position yourself on the right side of the transaction is closing by the hour. Subscribe now. We are tracking the money that moves when the tanks stop rolling. To understand the smoke rising over the Orinoco Belt today, you must first smell the burning archives of the 3rd century. The timeline is not linear, it is recursive. In the year 260 AD, the Roman Empire faced an existential mathematical impossibility that mirrors our own ledger with terrifying precision. The silver purity of the denarius, the reserve currency of the known world, had collapsed from 95% under Augustus to a laughable 5%. The emperors had debased the currency to fund endless wars and bribe a restless populace, flooding the markets with worthless metal. The result was not just inflation, it was a total breakdown of trust. The soldiers stationed on the Rhine, men who bled for the eagle, stopped accepting the emperor's coin. They demanded payment in salt, in land, and in gold. When a government can no longer purchase loyalty with its currency, it faces a binary choice: collapse or confiscate. Rome chose the latter. This is what historians politely call administrative reform, but what forensic accountants identify as state-sanctioned theft. The empire ceased to be a trade partner and became a predator within its own borders. They initiated a series of seizures that stripped the provinces of hard assets, grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, to back a failing monetary system. They did not ask, they took. This is the Rome Protocol. It is the reflexive, violent convulsion of a dying hegemon that realizes its checkbook is empty but its sword is still sharp. The pattern is absolute. When the fiat disconnects from reality, the state must anchor itself to something physical, or it evaporates into the ether of history. At exactly 4 a.m. this morning, the United States executed the modern iteration of this ancient protocol. For decades, the Federal Reserve has printed trillions, diluting the dollar just as Rome diluted the denarius. We exported inflation to the world, trading green paper for cars, electronics, and resources. But the world has stopped accepting the paper. The BRICS nations are moving to gold. The bond market is screaming. The credit card of the American empire has been declined. So, naturally, the empire has returned to the source of all value. They aren't in Venezuela to install democracy. They are there to securitize a $17 trillion asset to place on the balance sheet of a bankrupt nation. The raid is not foreign policy, it is a margin call. Do not make the mistake of thinking this predation is limited to ancient history or distant shores. The Rome Protocol was executed on American soil less than a century ago, in broad daylight. In 1933, the United States faced a similar liquidity crisis. The Federal Reserve was cornered. The banking system was a hollow shell. The establishment's response was not to fix the money, but to steal the only honest competitor to the money. Executive Order 6102 was not a law, it was a raid. They didn't storm a foreign beach, they stormed the safe deposit boxes of their own citizens. Under the threat of 10 years in prison, the government forced the surrender of all monetary gold at $20.67 an ounce. Once they had seized the physical collateral, they immediately revalued it to $35, instantly devaluing every paper dollar in your grandfather's pocket by 69%. The theft was institutional, legal, and absolute. This is the hidden pattern. When the ledger breaks, the state does not negotiate. It seizes. For the last 50 years, the United States has been able to export this theft through the petrodollar system, forcing foreign nations to absorb our inflation. We didn't need to seize the gold, we just printed the paper that bought the oil. But that mechanism died the moment the interest payments on U.S. debt crossed the $1 trillion threshold. The math made a mockery of the printing press. The world stopped buying the debt, so the empire had to find a new asset to confiscate. They looked at the map and they saw Venezuela. The parallels are not just similar, they are identical. The only difference is the blast radius. In 1933, they came for the gold in your local bank. In 2026, they are coming for the energy reserves of an entire hemisphere. The seizure of the Orinoco Belt is the global version of Executive Order 6102. They are locking down the collateral before the run on the dollar begins in earnest. The raid on January 3rd was not an isolated military operation. It was the margin call being answered. The Rome Protocol is now fully active and it demands to be fed. If you are holding paper assets dependent on the good faith of this system, you are standing on the tracks of a freight train that has already lost its brakes. At 9:15 a.m. on January 3rd, while the smoke was still clearing over the Maracaibo Basin, the chairman of the Federal Reserve stepped up to a microphone in Washington. His suit was immaculate, his voice steady. He told the assembled press corps that the banking sector was resilient and that the Venezuelan intervention was a necessary measure to ensure regional energy stability. This was the lie. It was a carefully calibrated hallucination designed to keep the markets from panic selling the moment they realized the truth. While he spoke those words, the yield on the 10-year Treasury note spiked 40 basis points in 12 minutes, a statistical impossibility in a healthy market. The insiders weren't listening to the speech, they were watching the tanker manifestos. We call this Operation Absolute Resolve, but the data tells a different story. The Department of Energy knows that the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve is effectively drained, sitting at lows not seen since the 1980s. Meanwhile, beneath the jungle canopy of the Orinoco Belt, lie 303 billion barrels of proven reserves. Do the math. At current market rates, that is $17.3 trillion of tangible, burnable, tradable wealth. That number, 17 trillion, is not a coincidence. It is almost exactly the amount required to service the net interest and principal rollover of U.S. obligations for the next fiscal decade. This wasn't a military operation, it was a hostile takeover of a balance sheet. The establishment needs you to believe this is about politics because if you understood it was about solvency, the bank runs would start before lunch. They told you the dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the government. But faith doesn't pay a $1 trillion annual interest bill. Oil does. By seizing the fields, they have effectively pegged the dying dollar to Venezuelan crude. It is the last desperate grasp of a drowning giant trying to find purchase on a slippery rock. The soldiers on the ground think they are fighting for democracy. They are actually fighting to prevent a sovereign debt default. While the world's eyes are glued to the troop movements in Caracas, a far more dangerous maneuver is executing in the dark pools of New York and London. We are witnessing the precursor to the Great Freeze. You didn't see it because it didn't happen on a stock ticker. It happened in the repo market, the invisible plumbing of the global financial system. Overnight lending between banks has effectively halted. The banks know what the politicians are hiding. The collateral is bad. They have stopped trusting each other's ledgers. When banks stop trusting banks, the entire credit mechanism of the planet grinds to a halt. This is the silence before the tsunami. Here is the terrifying reality the establishment is terrified you will discover. Under the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, the rules of the game were quietly rewritten. They replaced bailouts with bail-ins. This legal framework allows a failing bank to recapitalize itself using the unsecured debt of its creditors. And who is the largest unsecured creditor of any bank? You are. Your savings account is not money in a vault. It is a loan you made to the bank. If the bank fails, they are legally empowered to seize your deposit and convert it into worthless equity in a bankrupt institution. They turn you from a saver into an involuntary bagholder. The raid on Venezuela was the signal that the liquidity crisis has gone critical. The smart money knows the system is insolvent. That is why, on a Friday evening very soon, the ATM screens will simply go black. There will be no error message. No out-of-service sign. Just a blinking cursor in the void. The banking apps on your phone will spin indefinitely. The customer service lines will be busy. This is the impossible event they promised would never happen. It is the moment the velocity of money hits zero. They seized the Venezuelan oil to backstop the sovereign debt and the derivative exposure of the elite, not to protect your checking account. The system has already defaulted, they just haven't sent you the notification yet. There is a fundamental law of physics that applies equally to economics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, it merely changes form. The same is true for wealth. When the stock market crashes, the money doesn't disappear. It transfers. It flees the burning building of paper assets and seeks the concrete safety of the real world. In 1923 Weimar Germany, as the mark turned to confetti, those who held government bonds lost everything. But those who held industrial machinery, farmland, or gold didn't just survive, they became the new aristocracy. We are currently standing at the precipice of the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. The operation, in Venezuela, is the starting gun. The smart money has already begun its migration. They are selling the peaks of the S&P 500 and buying the valley of hard commodities. The establishment wants you paralyzed by the chaos. They want you watching the soldiers in Caracas so you don't notice the price of gold breaking new all-time highs in every currency on earth except the dollar, and the dollar is next. This is the bifurcation of the world. On one side, you have financial assets, stocks, bonds, currencies, which are nothing more than claims on a system that is actively defaulting. On the other side, you have hard assets, things that exist without a counterparty. Gold does not need a CEO to report earnings. A barrel of oil does not need a central bank to give it value. A plot of arable land does not require a government permit to grow food. These are the planks of the Golden Lifeboat. While the masses fight over the scraps of a dying currency, the few are building arcs of tangible value. This is your final briefing. The strategy is simple, but the execution requires nerves of steel. You must divest from the counterparty risk of the system. If your wealth relies on a bank's solvency, a government's promise, or a corporation's earnings report, it is vulnerable. You need assets that are sovereign. Start with the monetary metals. Gold and silver are the only forms of money that have survived every empire collapse for 5,000 years. They are the insurance policy against the arrogance of central bankers. Next, look to the digital exit hatch. Bitcoin is the only asset in history that cannot be seized by a raid, cannot be diluted by a printer, and exists outside the jurisdiction of any falling regime. It is the life raft for the digital age. But do not neglect the physical world. Productive land is the ultimate dynasty builder. When the currency collapses, the price of a loaf of bread will be measured in hours of labor, not dollars. Owning the soil that produces the calories makes you a king in a world of paupers. Finally, invest in the only asset that walks out the door with you, your skills. In a high-friction economy, The ability to build, repair, heal, or defend is worth more than a master's degree in a dying theory. The Venezuelan raid proved that the state will do anything to survive. You must possess that same resolve. The cycle is relentless. The Roman eagle fell. The Spanish galleons sank. The British sun set. And now the petrodollar is burning. But do not despair. Chaos is a ladder for those who see the rungs. The empire may fall, but the prepared individual survives. The wealth isn't gone, it's just waiting for you to claim it. The window of opportunity is not closing, it is being nailed shut. The events of January 3rd were not a crisis, they were a notification. The system has signaled its intent to consume everything in its path to stay alive one more day. You now possess the hidden pattern. You can retreat into denial with the masses, or you can prepare with the few. We will continue to track the liquidity crisis as it moves from the periphery to the core. Subscribe. I have shown you the math. The rest is up to you.